before Israel had kings, before Jerusalem became the city of David, before the temple rose in glory. The story began with one man hearing the voice of God. His name was Abram, and he lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, a wealthy and powerful city in ancient Mesopotamia. Around him were temples, idols, merchants, families, and the comfort of a settled life. But the Lord called him to leave everything familiar behind. God told him to leave his country, his relatives, and his father's house, and go to a land that he would show him. Abram did not receive a map. He did not know the final destination. He only had a promise. God would make him into a great nation, bless his name, and through him, all the families of the earth would be blessed. At 75 years old, when most men would choose comfort and security, Abram chose faith. He took Sarai, his wife, Lot, his nephew, his servants, and all his possessions, and began the long journey toward Canaan. When he arrived at Shechem, in the heart of the land, God appeared to him again and said that this land would belong to his descendants. Abram built an altar there, marking the beginning of worship in the land of promise. But the path of faith was not easy. A famine drove him down into Egypt, and fear led him to make mistakes. Still, God protected him, preserved Sarai, and brought him back to Canaan. Years passed, and the promise of a child seemed impossible. But God's covenant did not depend on human strength. Abram would become Abraham. Sarai would become Sarah, and from their impossible old age, God would begin the nation of Israel at the appointed time, when every human hope seemed impossible. Sarah gave birth to a son, just as God had promised. Abraham was 100 years old, and Sarah was far beyond the age of bearing children. Yet the cry of a newborn filled their tent. They named him Isaac, which means laughter, because God had turned Sarah's doubt into joy, and Abraham's waiting into living proof that nothing is too hard for the Lord. Isaac was not just a child, he was the son of the covenant, the fragile link between God's promise and the future nation of Israel. But then came the test that would shake Abraham's faith to its deepest place. God told him to take Isaac, the son he loved, and offer him as a sacrifice on a mountain in the land of Moriah. The command seemed impossible to understand. How could God fulfill his promise through Isaac if Isaac had to die? Yet Abraham rose early, took his son, split the wood, and walked toward the mountain in silence. When Isaac asked, "Where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God will provide for himself the lamb." At the final moment, as Abraham raised the knife, the angel of the Lord called out and stopped him. A ram was caught in the thicket, and Isaac was spared. Abraham had learned that the promise belonged completely to God, and God himself would provide the sacrifice. Years later, Isaac grew into the heir of that promise and married Rebekah, a woman chosen through divine guidance. But Rebekah, like Sarah before her, struggled with barrenness until Isaac prayed for her. And the Lord answered. She conceived twins, and even before they were born, the children struggled within her. God revealed that 2 nations were in her womb, and the older would serve the younger. Esau was born first, red and hairy, a man of the field and a skilled hunter. Jacob followed, grasping his brother's heel, a sign of the struggle that would mark their lives. Esau was loved by Isaac, but Rebekah loved Jacob. One day, Esau came in from the field exhausted and hungry, and Jacob offered him stew in exchange for his birthright. Esau, careless with sacred things, sold the privilege of the firstborn for a single meal. Later, when Isaac was old and nearly blind, Rebekah helped Jacob disguise himself as Esau so he could receive the blessing of the firstborn. Jacob succeeded, but his victory came through deception, and deception brought consequences. Esau burned with anger and planned to kill him. So Jacob fled from home toward Haran, alone in the wilderness, with only a stone for a pillow. Jacob dreamed of a ladder reaching from earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending upon it. There, the Lord stood above him and repeated the promise given to Abraham and Isaac: the land, the descendant, and the blessing for all nations would continue through Jacob. When Jacob awoke, he was afraid and said, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." In Haran, Jacob worked for his uncle Laban and experienced the pain of being deceived himself. He loved Rachel, but Laban first gave him Leah, forcing him to work many more years. Through Leah, Rachel, and their servants, Jacob became the father of 12 sons, the future tribes of Israel. Yet Jacob still needed to be changed. On his way back to Canaan, he wrestled through the night with a mysterious man until daybreak. Wounded but refusing to let go, Jacob cried, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." There, his name was changed to Israel, meaning one who struggles with God. From that moment, the story was no longer only about one family. Through Jacob's 12 sons, the nation of Israel had begun. Among all the sons of Israel, Joseph stood apart. He was the firstborn son of Rachel, the wife Jacob had loved most deeply. And because of that love, Jacob gave Joseph a special robe, a garment that made his brothers feel forgotten, rejected, and humiliated. Joseph was young, honest, and favored, but he was also surrounded by jealousy. When he began to speak about the dreams God had given him, the hatred grew even darker. In one dream, his brother's sheaves bowed down to his sheaf. In another, the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowed before him. To Joseph, these dreams were mysterious signs of the future. To his brothers, they sounded like arrogance. Their resentment waited for the right moment. And that moment came when Jacob sent Joseph to check on them in the fields, as they saw him approaching from a distance, wearing the robe they despised. Their hearts turned cruel. At first, they wanted to kill him, but Reuben urged them not to shed his blood. So they stripped Joseph of his robe and threw him into an empty pit. While he cried out from below, they sat down to eat. Then a caravan of merchants passed by on its way to Egypt, and Judah suggested they sell him instead. For pieces of silver, Joseph was taken away from his family, his father, and everything he knew, to cover their sin. The brothers dipped his robe in goat's blood and brought it to Jacob. When Jacob saw it, his heart broke. He believed a wild animal had devoured his beloved son, and no one could comfort him. But Joseph was not dead. He was being carried into Egypt. And though he could not understand it yet, God was already working through the pain. Joseph was sold to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, and even as a slave, the Lord was with him. Everything Joseph touched prospered, and Potiphar placed his entire household under his care. But Joseph's integrity was tested when Potiphar's wife tried to tempt him. Joseph refused to sin against God, and because he chose righteousness, he was falsely accused and thrown into prison. It seemed as if obedience had only brought him more suffering. Yet even in prison, the Lord did not leave him. Joseph found favor, gained responsibility, and interpreted the dreams of Pharaoh's servants. Years later, when Pharaoh himself was troubled by dreams no wise man could explain, Joseph was brought from the dungeon to the palace, standing before the most powerful ruler in Egypt. Joseph did not claim glory for himself. He said that God would give Pharaoh the answer, Joseph revealed that Egypt would have 7 years of abundance, followed by 7 years of terrible famine. And he advised Pharaoh to store grain before the crisis came. Pharaoh saw the Spirit of God in Joseph and raised him from prisoner to governor of Egypt in a single day. When famine finally struck the land, Joseph's brothers came to Egypt seeking food and bowed before him without recognizing him. The dreams had come true. Joseph tested them and saw that guilt had changed them, especially when Judah offered himself in place of Benjamin. Then Joseph could hold back no longer. He revealed who he was, and his brothers were terrified. But Joseph spoke words that showed the power of God's plan over human evil. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. Through betrayal, slavery, prison, and famine, God preserved the family of Israel. Jacob and all his household came down to Egypt, 70 people in all. There, the chosen family would grow into a nation. But the land that first became their refuge would one day become their prison. Generations passed in Egypt, and the family of Israel grew from 70 people into a great multitude. The land that had once saved them from famine now became the place of their suffering. A new Pharaoh rose to power who did not remember Joseph and saw the Hebrews not as guests, but as a threat. He feared their numbers, their strength, and the possibility that they might join Egypt's enemies in time of war. So he enslaved them with bitter labor, forcing them to build storage cities and serve under cruel taskmasters. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the more the Israelites multiplied. Pharaoh's fear became hatred, and hatred turned into a command of death. Every Hebrew baby boy was to be thrown into the Nile River. In that dark time, a child was born from the tribe of Levi. His mother saw that he was beautiful and hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she placed him in a basket sealed with pitch and set it among the reeds by the riverbank. His sister watched from a distance, not knowing that God was guiding every moment. Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the Nile and found the child crying, though she knew he was one of the Hebrew babies. Her heart was moved with compassion. She adopted him as her own son and named him Moses, because she had drawn him out of the water. By God's providence, Moses' own mother was chosen to nurse him. So the child who would one day deliver Israel was raised, with the memory of his people and the protection of Pharaoh's house. Moses grew up in the palace, educated in the wisdom of Egypt, surrounded by wealth, power, and privilege. But deep inside, he knew he belonged to the suffering Hebrews. One day, when he was 40 years old, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. Filled with anger, Moses looked around, killed the Egyptian, and hid the body in the sand. He thought no one had seen him. But the next day, when he tried to stop 2 Hebrews from fighting, one of them said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you going to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses knew then that his secret was known. Pharaoh sought to kill him, and Moses fled into the wilderness of Midian. The prince of Egypt became a shepherd, and for 40 years he lived far from the cries of his people. But God had not forgotten Israel. Their groaning rose up from slavery, and the Lord remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. One day, while Moses was tending the flock near Mount Horeb, he saw a bush burning with fire. Yet the bush was not consumed. As he turned aside to look, the voice of God called from the flame, "Moses, Moses." Moses answered, "Here I am." God told him to remove his sandals, for the place where he stood was holy ground. Then the Lord declared that he had seen the affliction of his people, heard their cry, and had come down to deliver them. Moses was commanded to return to Egypt and stand before Pharaoh with the words, "Let my people go." Moses felt unworthy and afraid. He asked, "Who am I?" He asked what name he should give the Israelites. God answered, "I am who I am, the eternal God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." Was sending him, with Aaron as his spokesman. Moses returned to Egypt at 80 years old. Before Pharaoh, he demanded freedom for Israel, but Pharaoh hardened his heart. Then the Lord struck Egypt with plague after plague. The Nile turned to blood. Flux, gnats, flies, disease, boils, hail, locusts, and darkness fell upon the land. Each judgment showed that the gods of Egypt had no power before the God of Israel. Still, Pharaoh refused. Finally came the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. But God gave Israel a sign of protection. Each family was to sacrifice a spotless lamb and mark their doorposts with its blood. That night, judgment passed through Egypt, but where the blood was seen, death passed over. A great cry rose from Egypt, and Pharaoh finally broke. He told Moses and Aaron to take the people and go. After centuries of bondage, Israel walked out of Egypt free, carrying the promise of God into the wilderness. The Exodus was not the end of Israel's journey. It was only the beginning of learning how to live as God's chosen nation. After Pharaoh released them, the Israelites moved into the wilderness, guided by the presence of the Lord. By day, a pillar of cloud went before them, and by night, a pillar of fire gave them light. But Pharaoh's heart changed once again. He regretted letting his slaves go, gathered his chariots, and pursued Israel with the full force of Egypt's army. Soon the people found themselves trapped between the Red Sea in front of them and Pharaoh's army behind them. Terror filled the camp. They cried out against Moses, asking if he had brought them into the wilderness to die, because there were no graves in Egypt. But Moses stood before the frightened nation and declared, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord." Then God commanded Moses to stretch out his staff over the sea. Through the night, a strong wind blew. The waters divided, and a dry path opened through the middle of the sea. Israel walked forward with walls of water on their right and on their left. When the Egyptian army followed, God threw them into confusion. And as morning came, the waters returned. Pharaoh's chariot, horses, and soldiers were buried beneath the sea. Israel stood on the far shore, free at last, and they knew that the Lord had fought for them. Moses and the people sang a song of victory, praising God as their strength, their salvation, and the mighty warrior who had overthrown Egypt. But freedom quickly revealed the weakness of their faith. After 3 days in the wilderness, they found water at Marah, but it was bitter. The people complained, and God showed Moses a piece of wood that made the water sweet. Soon after, they complained again because they were hungry, remembering the food of Egypt while forgetting the chains. In Mertzah, God sent quail in the evening and manna in the morning, bread from heaven that appeared on the ground each day. They were to gather only what they needed, trusting God for tomorrow. Through manna, the Lord taught Israel daily dependence. When they thirsted again at Rephidim, God brought water from the rock. The people were free from Pharaoh, but their hearts still had to be freed from fear, unbelief, and the habits of slavery. 3 months after leaving Egypt, Israel arrived at Mount Sinai. The mountain became covered in smoke, thunder, lightning, and the sound of a trumpet that grew louder and louder. God descended in fire, and the whole mountain trembled. There, the Lord called Israel into covenant. He told them that if they obeyed his voice and kept his covenant, they would be his treasured possession among all peoples, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The people answered, "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." Then God gave the 10 Commandments, the foundation of their life with Him. Worship no other gods. Make no idols. Honor His name. Keep the Sabbath. Honor father and mother. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness. And do not covet. These laws were not simply rules. They were the shape of a holy life under a holy God. But while Moses remained on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights, the people became impatient. They gathered around Aaron and demanded a god they could see. Aaron collected their gold and formed a golden calf. And the people said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." The nation that had seen the Red Sea split now bowed before an idol. When Moses came down and saw the calf, the dancing, and the corruption, he threw down the tablets of the covenant, breaking them at the foot of the mountain. Judgment came upon the camp. But Moses interceded for the people, pleading with God not to destroy them. The Lord showed both justice and mercy. He renewed the covenant, revealed His name as compassionate and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and commanded the building of the tabernacle, a holy dwelling place where His presence would remain among His people. When the tabernacle was finished, the glory of the Lord filled it. The cloud covered it by day, and fire rested over it by night. Israel had been rescued from Egypt, given the law, forgiven after rebellion, and surrounded by the presence of God. But the wilderness journey was far from over, and the greatest test of their faith was still ahead. After the covenant at Sinai, Israel stood at the edge of a new destiny. They had been rescued from Egypt, carried through the Red Sea, fed with manna from heaven, given the law of God, and surrounded by the glory of the Lord in the tabernacle. Now the time had come to move toward the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. From Kadesh Barnea, Moses sent 12 men, one leader from each tribe, to spy out the land of Canaan. For 40 days, they explored its valleys, mountains, cities, and fields. When they returned, they carried a cluster of grapes so large that it had to be hung on a pole between two men. The land was rich, fruitful, and flowing with milk and honey, just as God had said. But 10 of the spies looked at the fortified cities and the powerful people living there, and fear overcame their faith. They said, "We are not able to go up against them. They are stronger than we are." Only Joshua and Caleb stood against the panic. They told the people that if the Lord was pleased with them, He would bring them into the land and give it to them. But the nation listened to fear instead of faith. That night, the whole congregation cried, complained against Moses and Aaron, and spoke of choosing another leader to take them back to Egypt. After all the miracles they had seen, they still believed slavery was safer than trusting God. The Lord declared that this unbelieving generation would not enter the promised land. Everyone 20 years old and older, except Joshua and Caleb, would die in the wilderness for 40 years. 1 year for each day the spies had explored the land. Israel would wander until a new generation arose. The wilderness became a place of judgment, but also a place of mercy. God did not abandon His people. Their clothes did not wear out. Their sandals did not fail. And manna continued to fall from heaven. Yet rebellion still followed them. Korah, Dathan, and Abiram challenged the leadership of Moses and Aaron, claiming that all the congregation was holy, and asking why Moses lifted himself above the people. But God defended the leaders He had chosen, and the earth opened beneath the rebels, swallowing them and their households. Later, when the people complained again because there was no water, Moses and Aaron fell before the Lord. God told Moses to speak to the rock, and water would come out. But Moses, worn down by years of rebellion, struck the rock twice with his staff and spoke harshly to the people. Water came out abundantly, but Moses had failed to honor God as holy before Israel. Because of this, the Lord told Moses and Aaron that they would not bring the people into the promised land. For Moses, the man who had faced Pharaoh, divided the sea, carried the people through the wilderness, and spoken with God face to face. This judgment must have been heartbreaking. Still, he continued to lead. In the final year of their journey, the people again became impatient and spoke against God and Moses. Judgment came through fiery serpents, and many Israelites died from their bites. When the people confessed their sin, God told Moses to make a bronze serpent and lift it on a pole. Whoever looked at it in faith would live. Once again, mercy rose in the middle of judgment. At last, after 40 long years, Israel camped on the plains of Moab, across the Jordan from Jericho. Moses knew his time was ending. He gathered the new generation and spoke to them from his heart. He reminded them of Egypt, the Red Sea, Sinai, the manna, the rebellions, and the faithfulness of God. He warned them not to forget the Lord. When they entered a land of cities, they did not build. Wells they did not dig, and vineyards they did not plant. He called them to love the Lord with all their heart, soul, and strength, and to teach his words to their children. Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo, and from its heights, God showed him the land of promise. He saw it with his eyes, but he would not cross over. There, at 120 years old, Moses died according to the word of the Lord. His eyes were not dim, and his strength had not faded. Israel mourned him for 30 days. But the mission continued. Moses had brought the people to the edge of the promise. Now Joshua would lead them in. After the death of Moses, the future of Israel stood at a dangerous and holy turning point. The great prophet who had confronted Pharaoh, divided the sea, received the law, and led the people for 40 years was gone. And now Joshua, the son of Nun, stood before a nation waiting to enter the land of promise. The task before him was enormous. Canaan was not empty. It was filled with fortified cities, powerful kings, and people who would not surrender their land without war. But the Lord spoke to Joshua with the command that would define his leadership: be strong and courageous. God promised that every place the sole of his foot would tread would be given to Israel, just as he had promised Moses. Yet victory would not come by courage alone. Joshua had to meditate on the law day and night, obey the word of God carefully, and lead the people not just as soldiers, but as a covenant nation. The first obstacle before them was the Jordan River, overflowing its banks during harvest season. Humanly speaking, it was the worst time to cross. But God was about to show this new generation that the same power that opened the Red Sea could open the way into Canaan. The priests carried the Ark of the Covenant toward the river, and the moment their feet touched the water, the flow stopped, the river stood still, and Israel crossed on dry ground. From the riverbed, 12 stones were taken and set up as a memorial at Gilgal, so that one day, when children asked what those stones meant, their parents could tell them how the Lord had brought Israel into the land. Before the battles began, the men born in the wilderness were circumcised, renewing the covenant that marked them as God's people. Then the manna, which had fed them for 40 years, ceased. The wilderness season was over. Israel would now eat from the fruit of the land. But their first great challenge was Jericho, a city sealed behind mighty walls. God's battle plan seemed strange. For 6 days, the people would march around the city once each day, in silence, with priests blowing trumpets before the ark. On the 7th day, They would march around the city 7 times. Then, at the sound of the trumpets, the people would shout. Joshua obeyed exactly. On the 7th day, the trumpet sounded, the people shouted, and the walls of Jericho collapsed. Israel's first victory in Canaan came not through siege engines or military genius, but through obedience and divine power. Yet after Jericho came a painful lesson. A small city named Ai defeated Israel because one man, Ashon, had secretly taken forbidden spoil from Jericho. His hidden sin brought judgment on the whole camp. Israel learned that victory required holiness, not just bravery. After the sin was exposed and judged, Ai was conquered. Joshua continued leading campaigns across the land, defeating kings in the south and north, breaking enemy coalitions, and securing the inheritance of the tribes. But the conquest also brought warnings. The Gibeonites deceived Israel by pretending to come from a distant land, and Joshua made a treaty with them without asking the Lord. It was a reminder that even wise leaders can fail when they trust appearances more than God's direction. In time, the land was divided among the tribes. Caleb, who had believed God when others were afraid, received his inheritance. The Levites received cities instead of territory, because the Lord himself was their inheritance. Cities of refuge were established for justice and mercy. Near the end of his life, Joshua gathered Israel at Shechem and reminded them of the entire story. Abraham called from beyond the river, the Exodus from Egypt, the wilderness, the Jordan, and the land God had given them. Then he placed a choice before the nation: serve the false gods of the nations, or serve the Lord. Joshua declared, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." The people promised to follow God, and a covenant was renewed that day. For a time, Israel served the Lord. But after Joshua and his generation passed away, another generation would rise that did not know the Lord or the works he had done. The land had been conquered, but the battle for Israel's heart was only beginning. After Joshua died, and after the elders who had seen the mighty works of the Lord passed away, a new generation rose in Israel that did not know the Lord or remember what he had done for their fathers. The land had been conquered, the tribes had received their inheritance, and the people were finally living in the promise given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But possessing the land did not mean their hearts belonged fully to God. Instead of driving out the pagan nations completely, Israel began to live among them, learn from them, marry into them, and worship their gods. The altars of Baal and Asherah rose in the land where the Lord alone was supposed to be worshipped. The people who had been called to be holy became like the nations around them. Soon, the history of Israel entered one of its darkest cycles. They would abandon God, fall into idolatry, and become oppressed by their enemies. Then, in their suffering, they would cry out to the Lord, and in His mercy, God would raise up a judge to deliver them. But when that judge died, the people would return to their old sins, often becoming even worse than before. This pattern repeated again and again for generations. It was a cycle of rebellion, judgment, crying out, rescue, and relapse. Yet even in their unfaithfulness, God did not forget His covenant. He raised up deliverers, not because Israel deserved it, but because His mercy was greater than their failure. Othniel delivered them from Mesopotamian oppression. Ehud, a left-handed man from Benjamin, struck down the Moabite king Eglon and brought freedom to the land. Deborah, a prophetess and judge, sat beneath her palm tree and led Israel with wisdom when courage was rare. Through her, and through Barak, God defeated the army of Sisera, showing that victory still belonged to the Lord. Then came Gideon, a fearful man hiding from the Midianites, in a winepress. When the angel of the Lord called him a mighty warrior, Gideon could hardly believe it. He felt weak, small, and unqualified. But God saw what Gideon could become through divine strength. With only 300 men, carrying trumpets, jars, and torches, Gideon defeated a massive Midianite army so that Israel would know the victory did not come from human numbers, but from God. Still, even Gideon's story ended with warning, because the people were quick to turn objects of victory into objects of idolatry. Later, Jephthah rose as a rejected man who became a deliverer, but his story was marked by tragedy and a foolish vow. Then came Samson, a man set apart from birth, given supernatural strength by the Spirit of God. He was called to begin delivering Israel from the Philistine, but his life was filled with pride, passion, and compromise. He could tear apart a lion, strike down enemies, and carry away city gates. Yet he could not master his own desires. His relationship with Delilah led to his downfall. Betrayed, blinded, and chained in a Philistine prison, Samson seemed finished. But in his final moment, he cried out to the Lord, and God gave him strength one last time. He brought down the Philistine temple, killing more enemies in his death than in his life. The age of the judges was filled with moments of courage, but also with moral confusion. The repeated statement of that time was simple and devastating. There was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This was not freedom, it was spiritual collapse. Without faithful obedience to God, the tribes became divided, justice became weak, and worship became corrupted. Yet in the middle of this darkness, God quietly preserved hope. The story of Ruth shines like a candle in a violent age. She was a Moabite widow, an outsider by birth, but she chose the God of Israel and showed covenant loyalty to Naomi. Through her marriage to Boaz, she became part of the family line that would lead to David, the future king. While the nation was drifting, God was still preparing his plan. The period of the judges proved that Israel needed more than temporary rescuers. They needed righteous leadership. They needed a king. But more than that, they needed hearts that would return to the Lord. The darkness of the judges created a deep longing for leadership. And in that longing, Israel turned to Samuel, the last great judge and prophet of that age. Samuel had been born as an answer to the prayers of his mother Hannah, who dedicated him to the Lord from childhood. He grew up serving in the tabernacle at Shiloh, and as he matured, all Israel recognized that God was with him. His words carried authority, because they were not the words of ambition, but the words of the Lord. Yet when Samuel grew old, his sons did not walk in his ways. They accepted bribes, twisted justice, and failed to lead the people with righteousness. So the elders of Israel came to Samuel with a demand that wounded his heart. They said they wanted a king to judge them like all the other nations. Samuel prayed, and the Lord revealed the deeper truth. Israel was not merely rejecting Samuel, they were rejecting God as their king. Still, God allowed them to have what they asked for. Samuel warned them that a human king would take their sons for war, their daughters for service, their field, their harvests, and their freedom. But the people insisted, and soon Saul, a tall and impressive man from the tribe of Benjamin, was chosen as Israel's first king. At first, Saul seemed humble and promising. He delivered Jabesh-Gilead from the Ammonites and brought hope to a scattered nation. But beneath his royal appearance was a heart ruled by fear, impatience, and insecurity. At Gilgal, when Samuel delayed coming to offer sacrifice before battle, Saul panicked and offered the sacrifice himself. Stepping into a role that was not his to take, Samuel rebuked him and declared that his kingdom would not endure. Later, Saul was commanded to destroy the Amalekites completely, but he spared King Agag and kept the best animals, claiming they were for sacrifice. Samuel's response became one of the great truths of Scripture. Obedience is better than sacrifice. Because Saul rejected the word of the Lord rejected him as king. Then God sent Samuel to Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse, to anoint a new king. When Samuel saw Jesse's older sons, strong and impressive, he thought the chosen one must be among them. But God said, "Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." Finally, the youngest son was called from the fields. His name was David, a shepherd boy. Samuel anointed him, and from that day, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David. David first became known to Israel through a battle no one else dared to fight. The Philistine giant Goliath mocked the armies of the living God for 40 days, and all Israel trembled. But David saw the situation differently. To him, Goliath was not too large to defeat, he was too defiant to ignore. With no armor, no sword, and no fear, David went forward with a sling and 5 smooth stones. He declared that the battle belonged to the Lord, and with 1 stone, he struck Goliath down. Israel rejoiced. But Saul's heart filled with jealousy when the people praised David more than him. From that day, Saul watched David with suspicion and soon tried to kill him. David became a fugitive, hiding in caves, deserts, and foreign lands. Even though he had been anointed to be king, twice he had the chance to kill Saul, and twice he refused, saying he would not raise his hand against the Lord's anointed. David trusted that God would give him the throne in his own time. Finally, Saul's reign ended in tragedy on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines defeated Israel. Saul's sons were killed, including Jonathan, David's beloved friend, and Saul fell on his own sword. When David heard the news, he did not celebrate. He mourned deeply and cried, "How the mighty have fallen." After years of waiting, David was made king over Judah, and later all the tribes came to him and made him king over all Israel. He conquered Jerusalem, made it his capital, and brought the Ark of the Covenant into the city with worship and celebration. Under David, Israel became united, strong, and centered around the presence of God. Yet David's greatest honor was not military victory or political power. God made a covenant with him, promising that his throne would be established forever. From David's line would one day come the true king, the son of David, whose kingdom would never end. David's reign brought Israel to a place of unity, strength, and covenant hope. But his final years were marked by sorrow, family conflict, and the question of who would sit on the throne after him. Before his death, David made it clear that Solomon, the son of Bathsheba, would become king. Solomon began his reign not with arrogance, but with humility. When the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Ask what I shall give you," Solomon did not ask for long life, wealth, or the death of his enemies. He asked for wisdom, an understanding heart, to govern God's people and to discern between good and evil. This pleased the Lord, and God gave Solomon not only wisdom, but also riches, honor, and glory. Unlike any king before him, Solomon's wisdom soon became famous throughout Israel when 2 women came before him, claiming the same baby. By ordering that the child be divided with a sword, Solomon revealed the true mother, because she would rather give up her son than see him die. The people feared the king, knowing that the wisdom of God was in him. Under Solomon, Israel entered its golden age. The kingdom became wealthy, powerful, and respected among the nations. Trade expanded. Silver became common in Jerusalem, and kings and queens came from far away to hear Solomon's wisdom. But Solomon's greatest achievement was the building of the temple in Jerusalem, the house of the Lord that David had longed to build. For 7 years, workers prepared stone, cedar, gold, bronze, and sacred furnishings. When the temple was completed, the Ark of the Covenant was brought inside, and the glory of the Lord filled the house so powerfully that the priests could not stand to minister. Solomon prayed, confessing that even the highest heavens could not contain God, yet asking the Lord to hear the prayers offered toward this holy place. It seemed Israel had reached the height of its calling. The land was secure. The temple stood in glory, and the Son of David sat on the throne. But beneath the beauty of gold and stone, spiritual danger was growing. Solomon loved many foreign women, and they turned his heart away from the Lord. In his old age, he followed other gods and built high places for idols. The wisest king in the world allowed his heart to become divided. Because of this, the Lord declared that the kingdom would be torn from Solomon's house, though not during his lifetime. For the sake of David, after Solomon died, his son Rehoboam became king. The people came to him with a request: "Your father made our yoke heavy. Now lighten our burden, and we will serve you." The older counselors advised Rehoboam to answer with kindness and become a servant to the people. But he rejected their wisdom and listened to the arrogant young men who had grown up with him. He answered harshly, saying that his father had disciplined them with whips, but he would discipline them with scorpions. With that foolish decision, the united kingdom shattered. 10 tribes rebelled and followed Jeroboam, forming the northern kingdom of Israel. Only Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to the house of David, forming the southern kingdom of Judah. What had taken generations to build was broken in days. But Jeroboam, fearing that his people would return to Jerusalem to worship, made 2 golden calves and placed them at Bethel and Dan, saying, "Behold your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." This sin poisoned the northern kingdom from its beginning. Meanwhile, Judah also struggled with idolatry and unfaithfulness. The glory of Solomon's age faded quickly. Egypt invaded Jerusalem, and the treasures of the temple and palace were carried away. Gold was replaced with bronze, a symbol of how far the nation had fallen. From Abraham's call to the division of the kingdom, Israel's history revealed one great truth: God remained faithful, even when his people did not. The promises to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and David were not destroyed by human failure. They continued forward, waiting for their final fulfillment in the true Son of David, the King whose kingdom would never be divided and would never end.